Ed gave some history of organizing, and it's sort of important how it all works. A lot of what's the history of community welfare centers goes back to first the Tonby centers in the United Kingdom, and then things like Jane Addams' Hull House in Ed, Chicago. All of these were fundamental factors in determining what a community welfare center might be. Now you have community welfare centers similar to what you have in Korea in every continent of the world. There are always 7 or 8 similar conditions. They emphasize geography. They concentrate on people and not professionals. They link people and government. They concentrate on building community partnerships. They provide direct assistance and benefit support. They give advice and assistance to the disadvantaged. And importantly, many community welfare centers around the country advocate for reform. Where the trends of community organizing and Saul Alinsky took a different path from community welfare centers in a classic form, as Ed went through, had to do with power. Understanding that it wasn't enough to advocate or to be outside of the community in the middle-income progressive movement, as many of these people were, but it was important to actually allow people to build their own organizations. Alinsky came out of, it was heavily influenced in his organizing model by the labor movement. That meant trying to put together a federation, a congress, if you will, a people's organization, an organization of organizations, where different groups were put together in a geographical community to give the kind of legitimacy and then potentially put the pieces together to build power. Because of his experience in Chicago, which was a big-time political machine operation, he always eschewed anything that was anywhere close to political activity. Numbers equal power, not voting. That was an important part of the Alinsky ideology, if you will. As Saul Alinsky in the white picture, the critique that became part of what drove other models of organizing in different directions than Alinsky had to do with the massive change at the same time in urban America and cities driven by human rights and civil rights movements, particularly for African Americans trying to win the right to vote. These were indigenous movements in the United States. There were movements against the war. There were organizations and movements of welfare recipients like the National Welfare Rights Organization that allowed me to work for them at 20 years old, of all things. There were movements of renters in the tenants organization. Alinsky was not comfortable with movements. He wanted a stable, so-called permanent organization. His view of organizers, you came in, you came out. And the notion of these unruly movements that sort of cropped up and burned quickly like a flame and maybe lasted and maybe didn't, even though sometimes they created huge and amazing changes, was uncomfortable in the Alinsky model. So there started to be other strands in organizing, and one of those strands that was more comfortable with both the Alinsky model as well as movements and was looking for another way to move was, frankly, Acorn. So I started Acorn June of 1970. I was 21 years old. There's the flag, and basically I was coming out of an experience where I thought it was important to have a different organization than Alinsky built and that Welfare Rights built. What I tried to do was create something that was multi-issued, to deal not only with community issues, but also tenant issues, welfare issues, veterans issues, issues of homeless, issues of jobs, but also was multiracial. Many neighborhoods weren't multiracial. It was important to build an organization that was. It was important to build an organization that was built around what I call the majority constituency, not just welfare recipients, for example. In Boston, when I worked in Boston, Massachusetts, 1 out of 7 citizens in Boston were on welfare. but that was only 1 out of 7. So as much power as you could try to build, and you know this from your community welfare centers, you were still talking about a minority of people. You didn't have enough pieces together to build the kind of power that was important. So we wanted to build an organization of low and moderate income families that then had a majority so that we could contend for power. We had members, and this was a very important difference in how the organizing model was constructed. It didn't advocate for people, it actually allowed people, somewhat like a union in the community, to pay dues, to be elected as officers, to actually run the organization, and it was all built around that membership base. That membership base, those leaders, as Ed was talking about in his story of his organization, don't necessarily understand the rhetoric that power equals numbers, and that somehow you can't be involved in elections. So we, from the very beginning, if the members voted, they wanted to get involved in elections, so be it. If they wanted to endorse somebody, so be it. Nothing prevented what we called coordinated autonomy. Within their community, they could do whatever they democratically decided to do. If they needed support from another community, they had to coordinate with that community. Give and take and bargain. If it was a citywide issue, put all the groups together. If it was a statewide issue, the groups in that state. And those things also made Acorn different because we looked at not being just a neighborhood organization, but then a city, state, and finally a national organization. So those things inform the discussion we're having about welfare and how to see it. People take action. But a lot of it has to do with people talking to each other. We started as a membership organization with community service centers ourselves in some funny ways. In 1971, only a year after Acorn was founded, we organized our first community service center, somewhat like your community welfare centers in North Little Rock. It had a food buyers club. It tried to give assistance on how to get onto public assistance and other programs. It was a meeting place. It was an office. As part of Acorn's activity until 2008, there were Acorn service centers, which were also very similar to your community welfare centers. Those service centers did taxes for people. They tried to make sure in the systems that worked in the United States, we had what we used to call maximum eligible participation. You were eligible for a whole set of programs, many of which in the United States people didn't receive. 70%, 65% participation in food stamps, 80% participation in unemployment. Welfare, as we used to know it, didn't exist in the same way. So in that kind of a system, we had to assist people to actually get on the program. And that's one of those things to do. We also help people do their taxes. We did 50,000 family taxes a year through these service centers that saved people some $20 million a year. We did housing counseling, helping people buy houses, fix their credit, find fair landlords, anything that served our members. We continue to do these kind of programs in Canada now. There's taxes being done in Canada, which we do today. We also run something like your community welfare centers. We run 4 centers in Delhi, India, that are centers for homeless workers. How did this happen? This is not a natural thing for Acorn. We're a direct action organization. We're community-based. The Commonwealth Games, which were a little sort of a British fake Olympics, if you will. I don't know how to explain it. Somebody could probably do a better job. But every several years, when the Olympics aren't going, all the people that used to be under the domination of the British Empire pretend that they get along and play sports together. That's the best I can figure. Well, it was very important to India to prove that it was a stepped-up, strong economic country, so it hosted the Delhi Commonwealth Games. But hosting it also meant that they destroyed and removed an entire slum where we were organizing in East Delhi. In that campaign, we weren't able to keep them from some of the slum removal, so to speak, but many of the informal workers that we unionized, rickshaw pullers, domestic workers, rag pickers, hawkers, they needed a place to live. In fighting about this, we ended up getting the Delhi Municipal Corporation to let us set up a center for people who were stuck as migrant workers in that situation and couldn't find a place to live. It's now evolved into 4 different centers in low-income areas. Delhi has actually 80 centers. This is what they look like. This is such an improvement over what they used to be. I can't even describe it. What happens at those centers, for those of you who are active in the community welfare centers here in Korea? People get together, they connect about work. They have computer literacy programs. The newspaper is read every morning to people before they go to work. You create a community, even of informal, irregular workers in those situations. The same thing happens in worker centers in the U.S., and the ability to impact jobs is more and more important for community-based organizations. And I'm sure it's important here in community welfare centers as well, from what we saw going in the neighborhoods of Seoul yesterday. One of the projects I was involved in 2008, 2009 was working with the largest worker center operation in the United States, Casa de Maryland, which runs a half-dozen worker centers outside of Washington, D.C. What they realized, and this is very important, I hope, in terms of how you look at this goal of moving 20% of your program in the community welfare centers to community organization, is that they had the centers, they had thousands of people going through, but they had no power. So what they asked me to help them do was build a membership. And so now they have a membership of some 10,000 people that's not only participates in the worker centers, but is able to protect them, to go to the legislature in Annapolis, to help pass a version of what we call in the U.S. the DREAM Act, Citizen Education for Immigrant Workers. Remember, the base, the majority, you have to have members. You have to have people who can operate directly in order to make these things work. And that goes to the heart of what this conference is about as well. Now, all of you have the paper in front of you, so I hope you're not counting on looking at the screen. So if you think I'm going to show the paper in Korean and English, not happening, so I guess we're all on the same page, right? So if you can look at your laps, you've got the paper. You look up here, okay. Sustainability. You have a good mayor. We have a good system here. You want to do better on welfare. Part of the conflict, though, is how to make this happen. How do you get the month and money to align, as we say? Here's an example from Italy. David Tasso, who's on the far right, is our head organizer for Acorn Italy. And we started a campaign almost a year ago that was very interesting. They changed the law for renters and for landlords in Italy because nobody paid taxes. It was all what's called a black market. You sort of winked and nodded. You said, okay, you want to rent from me. I'm going to let you pay less rent, but I'm not going to register the property or pay taxes. You're not going to pay taxes. Wink and nod. It's a better deal. Well, Italy's broke as a joke right now, as you know from the papers. So they had to pass a law, and as of June 1st of last year, all property either had to be registered or something else was triggered. And what was triggered was almost like a bounty system. A tenant, a renter, who had been winked and nodded before, we set up a 3-step, 2-step program where they could then put their landlord's property on the tax rolls. And the law provided that if you did that, you then had a reduction of your rent to 85 to 90% of what it had been. So if you were living in Rome, tight real estate market, and you were paying 1,000 euros for rent in your place, what would happen? You know the math. 90% deduction, you're only paying 900. You're only paying 100 euros, you're saving 900. And that's good for the term of an Italian lease. Well, I can look at here out in this crowd, and I know many of you are wondering, what would it take to have a lease in Rome? You're asking yourself that question. I can tell. You want to live in Rome. What would it take to have that lease? 4 years of the lease, 4 years option to renew. So when we win this for each individual tenant in this campaign now in Italy, they then get a reduction of 90% of their rent for 8 years. How does that make the organization sustainable? They then pay dues, that's 10% of their saving. So for the members who are paying dues every month, 10% of what they saved, the organization in 9 months was self-sufficient, able to start scaling and expanding. Did it get money from the Italian government to do that? No, I don't think so. The city of Rome, Sicily? No. Did it put more property on the tax rolls? Absolutely. And that's the point of community organizing. You have a system somewhat like this in Korea, but I'm sure we don't want to talk about it, like the paparazzi system, where you can turn in people that have stumbled their toes against the law and collect a bounty. I won't discuss it, but I'm just saying there might be an organizational way to take advantage of something that now is a free-for-all. It could be a fee-for-all to support an organization. We could have done the same thing in Acorn, perhaps if we'd learned these lessons earlier. And for all the housing we were doing taxes, we didn't collect any fees other than the basic dues. Members always wanted to pay for it, we just wouldn't take it. We just weren't thinking ahead. Part of the problem is that in the way things are changing now, neoliberalism is part of what we deal with everywhere, and that's a shifting of responsibility that was public, like your community welfare centers, onto private individuals. It's a problem here in Korea as well, certainly, and scholars have looked at this. Lim and Jang talk about the fact that there's a contradiction here in Korea between, I'll read this, the government's attempts to encourage labor flexibility while providing more social welfare measures shows not only a contradictory positioning among the power elite, but also the government's inability to grasp the commingling of the problem. Well, in English, what that means is you can't both create a huge workforce of irregular workers, lose labor protections, as has happened in many areas of Korean commerce, and also say that, oh, well, we're increasing social welfare, and have that balance out. These things have to align. And my argument would be that community organizing is part of what could help them align. In some ways, because it is, in fact, based on the community itself. And we see this all over the country. In Korogochu, for example, the slum where we organize in Nairobi, this is the founding of an organization. The tradition there is you plant a tree to symbolize the new growth of something, an organization in the community. And you plant it in the chief's village. Well, in the same way you call things villages here in Seoul, they call them villages in Nairobi. They aren't really villages. They're not really a chief. There's an appointed official by the Nairobi City Council who calls himself a chief, but basically that's your local government, your district government leadership. But it does build a community, and it pushes for why you need to force there to be government participation in their role, even while you're doing in the community as much as you can. This is Dharavi. We organize rag pickers in Dharavi. If you ever saw the movie Slumdog Millionaire, that's where it is. We have a sorting center and a recycling center that also works somewhat like your community welfare centers, in that it's a meeting place, computer literacy, people get their ration cards there, people get IDs there. This is how people interact, not only with themselves and their community, but how they build pressure on the government through organizing to make things happen. Peru, San Laragancho, same thing. What did we win? A community center. I would also argue that the advocacy role that has been so central in community welfare centers should also be something that people are trained to be able to handle themselves. When I wrote the ACORN model in 1973, coming out of my experience with welfare rights, there was a grievance committee, a way that individual members could be trained to assist others in trying to get benefits, access, solve issues. That model is actually translated on our website in Korean, so if anybody ever wants to read it, it's available for the picking, as they might say. This same thing is true in unions, where you obviously have stewards who operate on grievances, work-related problems. My argument would be we need the same kinds of things in community. You don't need professional social workers to do that, or community organizers. You need a way that people are empowered with an organization behind them to be able to handle both collective issues as well as individual issues. Let's bring all the pieces together. The summary on this: there's people fighting to come back, people fighting together. Everything has to be community-centered. This is one of the strongest organizations, leadership in the world that I've ever seen in Bolivia. We visited with them recently. They didn't have a way to sustain themselves. We have to be community-centered, no matter how strong, but we also have to be people-centered. And people-centered means that we're focused on how we can help each other, not how we can be replaced by professionals. Empowerment also depends on autonomy, the same things that Ed was talking about. We need organizations that can act independently. Community welfare centers can help nurture and move forward with these organizations, but at the same time, they have to build power, which means they have to be able to act independently. That's the biggest sign I've ever seen, child. I got you. Good sign. Sustainability. ACORN International, in its work now, finally stepped back and said, much like I was so happy yesterday in touring some neighborhoods with our delegation of luminaries here, to see all the coffee houses. We actually bought the only Fair Trade's coffee house in New Orleans. Fair Trade, Grinds, coffee, okay, it's cute. Coffee house in New Orleans. And from the first day we took over, it financed the organizing in Tegucigalpa and San Pedro Sula, Honduras, Mexico City, Mexico, and Lima, Peru. So that in terms of getting other support, biodiesel production is the second thing we're involved in that can help support some of these offices. Sustainability is fundamental. There's a big controversy about whether or not service delivery, advocacy, and community organization are in a tension that is mutually exclusive. Our argument, and I've made this argument now in talking about the ACORN service centers and your community welfare centers, in fact, I think they can work together. But it has to be in service of a community organization trying to build power. So that these things, services, self-sufficiency, are tools. You can do all the housing counseling in the world, but you're not going to change the housing policy that discriminates against these women if you can't politically build a mass organization that can collectively change things in Congress or Parliament or the Diet or whatever you're doing. And that's what we had to do. But can they all fit together? Yes, if the priorities are clear. It still all comes down to, it's not Facebook. The Egyptian revolution was not a Facebook revolution. We took a delegation of 20 organizers there. It was still the same thing you know. People talking to people, door knocking, going house to house, going neighborhood to neighborhood, building the relationships. It's not about social networking. That's a communication tool. Organizing is still going to be people like that leader talking to others, getting them involved and fighting. The problem you have is that there are so few cities and countries that even care about welfare or helping people who are disadvantaged, or the 99%, or as George Romney calls it, the 47%, or whatever you want to say. This notion that you're willing to embrace the fact that we have to have a robust social welfare system that protects people, that allows them to rebuild, to collectively act, and to build a power that changes their lives. Because everybody has that kind of opportunity and potential. It's so important. You cannot fail. If there's ever anything any of us can do, it's been an honor to be here and be a pleasure to help.